You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. Chapter 36. As Aeliana's consciousness returned, fear pricked the fuzzy edges of reality. It made no sense, because for the first time in a long time, she felt almost no pain. The peaceful trill of birds met her ears, and bright light discouraged her from opening her eyes. She gasped, sitting upright and blinking against the day's light. "Cyrus?" she croaked out. "Hush, love. He's fine." Iris sat by her bedroll, urging her to lie back down. "He'll be back any moment." Silmar and I stayed behind, while the others went hunting. As if summoned by his name, Silmar shuffled from the cook fire to Aeliana's side. "What happened?" Aeliana remembered the sprites and Lover's Falls. She remembered Cyrus, dead, then alive, as she pulled the water from his lungs with magic. Her starlock burned against her chest, as if pulsing with the memory, but Aeliana reached for it anyway, reassured by its presence, its heat. "We were hoping you could fill in some of the details." The gravel in Silmar's voice seemed thicker. "You've slept straight through the night and half the day." Aeliana turned, taking in the way he leaned against his staff, even as he sat on a stack of bedrolls at her back. It was then she noticed the entire camp was packed up. Only Kendallin and Holm remained at the cook fire, but the supplies had all been tucked away for the journey. It was as if they'd been waiting for her to rise, and the moment she did, they'd begin their trek again. "How do you feel?" Iris asked. "Better?" Images of Cyrus floating in the lake flashed through Aeliana's mind. The moment the energy surged through her, drawing the water from his lungs. The instant relief, followed by the energy's return, the pain resurfacing. She shuddered as she recalled the dark spirits. How had they survived? "The man," she whispered. Silmar leaned in, weary eyes sharpening at her words. "There was a man who came. I didn't recognize him." The moment the words left her mouth, she realized they weren't entirely true. He'd been familiar, but her focus had blurred with his approach, and she couldn't remember many details. Silmar and Iris exchanged a glance. "Cyrus said as much." Iris tucked the stray hairs of Aeliana's braid behind her ear, stroking her head like a child woken from a nightmare. "The man was gone before the rest of us arrived. We've searched the surrounding area, but there's no trace of him." "It would seem he doesn't want to be found," Silmar ground out. "You say that like it's a bad thing." Aeliana couldn't help leaning into Iris, taking the comfort the older woman offered. The lack of pain made her aware of the exhaustion that couldn't be resolved with sleep alone. "If the man could be trusted, why wouldn't he show himself?" "Because there are 9 of us?" Aeliana suggested. Because he doesn't know if we can be trusted? Silmar gave a dissatisfied grunt in response. Why did you leave camp? Iris ducked her head with the question, but not quick enough to hide the wetness in her eyes. I'm sorry, She hesitated, wondering how much they knew, how much she should say. Did they know she'd used blood magic and called the dark spirits? And then gone after the sprites? Or did they think she'd simply gotten lost and ended up near Lover's Falls? She'd been desperate. But in hindsight, her plan, or lack of it, had been foolish. Was anyone else hurt? Silmar shook his head, watching her too closely. What about the dark spirits? We saw them from a distance, Silmar said. They were gone by the time we reached you. Eliana frowned. She shouldn't have used blood magic to save Cyrus. There had been enough energy with the Starlock, more than enough. But it had been instinctual to draw from her wounds, and she couldn't help wondering if it acted like a catalyst, giving her access to the rest of the power deep within her. But it had brought the dark spirits again. How had they not overtaken her? Footsteps rustled through the trees on their left, and Cyrus and Lukai stepped into the clearing. Eliana? Lukai broke into a grin, then quickened his pace. She stood, warmth filling her chest at the concern in his voice, the relief on his face. He pulled her into a hug, the sensation of his arms around her both foreign and strangely familiar. He pulled back to study her face, which felt tight with scabs. He brought his hands up to her jaw, cupping her face and running his thumbs over her skin. Eliana's cheeks heated at the intimate gesture, far too aware of everyone watching. But relief spread wherever his thumbs brushed, and soon her eyes were closed as she leaned into his healing touch. His hands lingered a moment longer after he'd fixed even the tiniest of scratches. Thank you, she whispered, then stepped back and cleared her throat. He reached for her hand, turning it over to trace a finger along the mark of her bond. I felt your pain when I searched for you. It felt like you were dying. She was, Cyrus said. Eliana's awareness expanded as she took in the return of those who'd been hunting. Holm and Kendallin had already started skinning the hide from some type of deer. Jasperus pulled Silmar aside for an update, and snippets of their conversation carried back to Eliana, the subject centering around whether it was too late in the day to travel farther. Weapons had been dropped in a circle at the base of a tree that was wider than Eliana was tall. The white bow and arrows Lukai had given her stood out in contrast to the green moss and brown trunks, beckoning Eliana to come pick them up. Can you tell us what happened? Lukai asked. I found Cyrus in the water. I was certain he was dead. The sprites told me. You spoke to the sprites? The disapproval in Silmar's tone hurt more than Eliana cared to admit. She hesitated, catching more frowns and averted gazes from the others. I thought the cost would be high to me. I didn't realize. No one spoke, not even those around the cook fire a dozen paces away. Only the sound of Holm's knife gutting the poor creature broke the silence. I'm so sorry. When Silmar suggested I be bled to help the weaning process, I didn't want to endanger the rest of you. Only it was too much for me to do it alone. I grew desperate. I knew you were coming, but so were the dark spirits. It was the only way I knew to keep you safe. She covered her eyes with her hands, shaking her head as she tried to understand her own justification. Only I still put you all in danger. A hand rested on her back, and Iris's soothing voice murmured in her ear. It sounds like you had two terrible choices, love. We'll never know if the other choice would have been worse. No sense dwelling on it. Eliana turned to Cyrus. But you could have died because of me. He shook his head. I slipped into the water and hit my head because of my own clumsiness. You saved my life. The stars watched out for us both. There's nothing to forgive. She opened her mouth to protest more, but Iris interrupted. What's done is done. She clasped Eliana's hand between both of hers and gave a squeeze. Kendallin snorted from her spot at the fire, drawing Eliana's eyes up. Several others avoided her gaze, replacing the reassurance Iris offered with doubt. What did the sprites say? Cyrus asked. They said I would have to sacrifice you if I wanted to be rid of my magic. When Cyrus's face paled, she quickly added, which is why I assumed that if I was willing to use my magic, I would be able to save you. You used your magic? Silmar stood, leaning against his staff. Still, a newfound strength emanated from him. Hope. Eliana squared her shoulders, shocked at the ripple of pride running through her. I did. She'd had to use blood magic, something that still left her feeling sick. But after tapping into the power in her blood, sensing where it resided and how she could access it, it was like a thread had been left behind, keeping her connected to it. She sensed that if she tried again, it would be easier to access, without the blood magic. Silmar's lips spread out, the motion probably a smile, but his scars twisted his face into more of a grimace. Then we can start training again. You were motivated to heal, to save. That's as good a test as any for now. Even if that skill fades as you're weaned off blood magic, it's something we can start with for your training. He glanced at Lukai. Your bondmate can help. Lukai gave Eliana an almost shy smile. Eliana turned to Cyrus. After you were revived, a man came. Who was he? I don't know. He showed up out of nowhere, but it was like he knew you'd be there. I don't know how to explain it. It was like he breathed in your energy and then pushed it out toward the dark spirits, sent them away. You told us he had no starlock, Silmar said. I didn't see one, but Veldin keeps his hidden. Maybe he did too. How was he able to send away the dark spirits? Every muscle in Eliana's body tensed. Her guardians had welcomed the dark spirits. She'd thought that if they came that close, it was impossible to resist inviting them in. Even Silmar had sounded hopeless when he'd said they'd deal with them. It wasn't his blood that called them, Silmar said. If you'd been alert, welcoming them in, it would have been far more difficult. Still, it's an impressive thing he did. She shuddered, knowing she'd almost welcomed the dark spirits. If they'd reached her before she found the sprites, would she have been unable to resist? Or if she hadn't used up all her magic to save Cyrus, would she have let them fuse with her like Arvid and Vera had? At first, I didn't see you breathing, Cyrus went on. But the stranger, it's like he was healing you. One moment, he was gripping your arms so hard, I thought he'd break them. The next, he was barely touching your starlock, your wrist, your throat. When your breath came back, he nearly collapsed. But the others shouted from the opposite bank, and he took off. What did he look like? Eliana asked. My height, brown hair. He gestured toward Silmar and Velden. Somewhere between them in age. That doesn't narrow it down much, Velden said with a smirk. Somewhere between youthful wisdom and declining senility. Silmar glared at Velden. Tattoos on his hands? Eliana asked. Cyrus nodded, eyebrows raised. You remember him? Eliana hesitated, not quite sure if she was remembering him from that night, or if she remembered him from one of her awakening visions. We'll camp here a second night, Silmar said. Rest and recover. There were mixed reactions around the fire, maybe because they were still so close to Lover's Falls, or maybe because they'd already broken camp. But people dispersed, dragging out the equipment they'd previously packed away. Silmar turned to Eliana, a question in his eyes. Do we train tonight while it's fresh in your mind? Or rest and train tomorrow after the pressure has built? Tonight. Eliana straightened to her full height. It wasn't much compared to Cyrus and Lukai, who still loomed over her, but at least she was eye level with Silmar's stooped figure. But probably not how you're thinking. There's only one time I've used my magic with focused control. She passed the horses, making her way to the tree to snatch up the white bow and arrows. She recalled the sensation of drawing the arrow back against her cheek. Only this time she remembered the tug in her chest. The desire for the arrow to meet its mark combined with the energy to put it in its place. The pull of magic. She hadn't carried these for days, even before they had the horses, because she'd been too weak. Even now, she lifted the bow and every muscle in her arms argued with her plan. But it was the only plan she had. Planting herself a fair distance from the others, she created targets in her mind, honing in on the distant node of a bamboo tree, then the large leaf of another. As they'd traveled, most of the bamboo had given way to lush forests, the trees' canopies blocking out all sunlight. The leaves were as big as her body, and the flowers held intoxicating scents. She picked each of these objects out, aiming for them like Cyrus had taught her, then pulling energy through her body and arms to create force behind the arrows, like she'd accidentally done before. She used such a minimal amount of energy, it was almost laughable. But her aim was true every time. The physical energy required to lift the bow was probably more than the relief she gained from expending the energy in her blood. But after emptying her quiver, she thought she detected a change, an ease to her lingering pain. A few daisies had sprouted by her feet. For the first time, she saw them as a mark of her power, rather than a mark of her sins. She still slid her boot over them as she turned, wondering if Silmar would consider this a waste of time. The entire camp had stopped to watch. A few shocked expressions scattered amidst Silmar's and Cyrus's pride. I taught her, just last month. Cyrus beamed. Veldon chuckled. Yes, her skill is most definitely a product of your excellent teaching. Lukai quietly gathered her arrows before dropping them in her quiver. He smiled, his gaze boring through her eyes until her soul felt bare. She didn't turn away, daring him to see her from every vulnerable angle, almost desperate for him to find her wanting in some way. His smile widened, and he nodded. Again.
Chapter 37. To Karyne's relief, Aura kept them riding at a fast pace. Still, it took them a week to reach the creek running from Lover's Falls. Hints of the other group's trail became obvious to Karyne: an old cook fire, prints in the soil from both man and horse. Aura's promise that they were gaining on Daisy no longer felt far-fetched. "We'll camp up ahead," Aura said, surprising Karyne. They still had a fair amount of time before the sun's sleep, and she'd been as determined to catch up as he was. Still, he was grateful. If they traveled much farther, it would be difficult to sneak out to the falls during the night to hunt for the cutlass and return by the sun's morn. "Maybe we should go farther from Lover's Falls," Riverin said. "Aren't the sprites close?" "Close enough." Aura's murmur came so low Karyne wondered if he imagined it. Gullet took to the treetops as if he understood it was time to make camp, and when they rounded the bend, it was clear someone else had recently camped there. Flattened grass and evenly cut bamboo shoots surrounded an old cook fire, showing evidence of more than a half-dozen people having slept in the clearing. Karyne's eyes narrowed at the surrounding trees filled with pockmarks, like someone had been practicing archery. He closed his eyes, searching for wisps of heat left from the memory of the people before him, but it had been too long. "They may be at least a few days ahead of us," he said. Aura nodded. "It should still be easy to catch them within a week or less. We can travel faster with fewer people." Her words were accurate, but something about the way she said them felt like a lie. "I wouldn't mind riding later into the night," Riverin said, even as he dismounted. His roan gelding stomped, eager to be freed for grazing. Riverin had taken to calling him Maw, claiming he didn't know which of his animals had the bigger mouth. "Get away from the sprites faster, catch up with the progeny sooner. Sounds like a win all around." Aura glanced at Karyne, her face passive. "No sense wasting a good campsite." She knew. Of course she knew Karyne's plans. Was there anything she didn't know? He slid off his horse, using the gelding to hide his irritation more than his guilt. Besides, she wasn't doing anything to stop him. She wanted him to find the cutlass. He paused. Did that mean he'd find it? How much did she really know? The gelding turned, nipping at Karyne's cheek, reminding him to keep working at the ties. While the horses grazed, Riverin and Karyne gathered sticks and dead grass, making use of the cook fire pit left by the group before them. Aura pulled out the bedrolls while mumbling to herself. "You won't tell me who you're after, but you'll follow her blindly?" Riverin asked. "She's been right so far." Karyne shrugged, eager to change the subject and avoid more of Riverin's questions. "Besides, she's better company than Lenda." Riverin laughed. "Lenda would be lying on the bedrolls, moaning about how miserable she was. I would have put valerian root and winter cherry in her soup tonight." Karyne couldn't help grinning, remembering all the times they'd used the herb's mild sedative properties to knock out Enla so she wouldn't follow them on their night excursions. Fed by emotion, the images grew stronger in his mind. Endless frustration as Karyne distracted her with a long, boring tale. Riverин's panic as the herbs got stuck in his pouch and wouldn't shake free. Enla's rage when she finally caught them. It was probably the real reason she employed a food taster. Do you actually have some out here? The plants grew in drier areas farther north and east, but they could come in handy if he wanted to slip away from camp. Riverin hesitated. I've been taking it nightly ever since Enla. Garen frowned, different images flooding his mind. Enla's tears, the fresh scar on her palm, Garen's outrage, and then Enla's pleas for Garen to spare Riverin's life. He probably would have killed Riverin that night if it weren't for Enla's request, and he would have hated himself for it the next day. He hated himself even now, knowing he'd wanted Riverin dead, and yet he still felt it would have been deserved. He left Riverin to tend the fire by himself. Aura had disappeared, so Garen took his time rubbing down his horse. The gelding nipped him again, but this time it didn't hold any urgency, and Garen felt like he'd earned some of the animal's favor. He ran a hand over the smooth white hair that stood out from the rest of the beast's black. You smell like a skunk, too. So, skunk it is. The horse whinnied, and Garen took it as acceptance of the name. As the sun finally slipped behind the trees, he rubbed down Aura's mare, figuring Riverin could take care of Ma. Aura returned, surprising them all with half a dozen fish. We'll need our energy for the tasks ahead. She set to work cleaning and cooking the fish, and if Riverin noticed that she gave double portions to Garen, he didn't say anything. The evening stretched out long for Garen as he waited for the others to fall asleep. Finally, near the height of the moon's reign, he crept away from camp, following the creek as it widened, drawing him toward the deepening sound of rushing water. He shivered, pausing to tune in to his surroundings at every rustle in the trees, every plunk from a fish in the creek. When he rounded the last corner and the waterfall came into view, he couldn't help stopping to admire it. A fine mist shrouded the base, and the drop had to be at least the height of 2 sun-gazers, maybe 3. But where were the sprites? Another rustle from the woods beside him automatically brought his hand to his sword. He tuned in to the noise, sensing a shape expanding until he recognized it as Riverin? The other man stumbled out of the woods, taking in Garen's sword with a crease in his brow. Garen sheathed his sword with a growl, muffled by the roar of the water. What are you doing here? Riverin shrugged, glancing back the way he'd come. Aura woke me. Said I needed to come help you. That woman. Garen frowned, but it was Enla's face that came to his mind, Enla's words that returned to haunt him. Trust Riverin to have your back, and stay away from Lover's Falls. Was there any point in following the first half of her advice if he was already ignoring the second? Not a word, do you understand? Not to me or the sprites. Not to Aura when we return. Riverin nodded, but his face had a sickly pale look under the moonlight. It contrasted the X on his forehead, which drew Garen's gaze. Come on, Garen mumbled, turning back to the path. Footprints led the way, small boots that probably belonged to a woman. His chest tightened with fear even though Aura swore Daisy was still alive, maybe even improving. What if Aura was wrong? What if she didn't actually know everything? Because Garen only saw footprints leading up, not back. Even if Riverin spoke, Garen wasn't sure he'd hear him over the water. When the path diverged, Garen hesitated, peering over the cliff's edge. One path seemed to lead straight to the waterfall. The other might have wound farther up to the waterfall's source. He wiped at the sweat running down his neck, but it was immediately replaced by warm mist from the falls. He tuned in to the heat of his surroundings, but nothing stood out besides the critters and plants inhabiting the small caves and crevices on the cliff's wall. Riverin nudged Garen's elbow, pointing at a muddy boot track just beyond, on the path leading to the waterfall. What if there was only a set of tracks leading this way because Daisy was still here? What if Aura had been willing to stop because she knew? The fear in Garen's chest crawled up his throat, leaving it tight with worry. He rushed along the path, watching for more tracks, both terrified and relieved when they continued. When the path stopped at the water's edge, wet rocks hid any more signs of Daisy's steps, but scattered on the liana vines and dry portions of rock were sprinklings of dried blood. Garen placed his fingers over the blood without hesitation. The images that came were blurry and rushed. Scratches on his face here, a shove in his back there, pain and anguish, betrayal. Despite the memories being incomplete, two things were clear to Garen. There was a cave beyond the vines, and the sprites had pushed Daisy off the cliff. Garen unsheathed his sword, then slashed at the vines with unbridled fury, as if the vines were the sprites and not merely the door to their lair. Moonlight poured through the opening, revealing two skeletons so tightly wrapped it was hard to tell where one began and the other ended. Riverin let out a sound of disgust and stepped away, but Garen was already walking through the remaining thorny vines, a small prick on his cheek reminding him of his own vulnerabilities. Inside the cave, the rush of water echoed from all directions, deafening Garen and leaving him on edge. He waited for his eyes to adjust, allowing time for Riverin to pull out his daggers. They moved as one, the years they'd spent apart vanishing as they came back to back like they'd trained, shimmying sideways through the cave. Trust Riverin to have your... Garen shook away the memory of Enla's words, not wanting to acknowledge the remainder of her advice. As the space grew smaller, Garen replaced his sword with the daisy dagger. Nothing stirred, or at least nothing they could see. Moonlight faded behind them, but an iridescence came from the cave walls, some type of luminescent algae lighting their path with its eerie glow. The deeper they walked into the cave, the more the sound of rushing water faded, replaced by the plink of water dripping deeper within. Eventually, to Garen's relief, the space widened, and he swapped out his sword once more. "Is this the end?" Riverin asked, his voice hushed. The cave extended to twice their height, branching out in a near circular shape that was as wide as it was tall. They turned in a circle, greens and blues reflecting off their blades, but besides the path they'd come from, there seemed to be no other entrance or exit. Piles of small critters' bones rested at the edges, blood dotting various parts of the ground and walls. There was more rock than soil beneath their feet, but, strangely enough, a handful of flowers grew from a small patch of dirt. The unnaturalness of it bothered Garen more than anything else he saw in the cave. For a moment, Garen was disappointed. He'd wanted a confrontation. He'd wanted to pull information about Daisy out of the creatures who'd hurt her by hurting them back. He mentally shook himself. This was better. Aura had said Daisy was fine, and without the sprites here, it would be easier to look for the cutlass. Garen drew energy from his starlock, pushing it out to form a small light in the palm of his hand until it grew to fill the room like a torch. He systematically searched through the bones, then palmed the walls of the cave until Riverin did the same. "Maybe if I knew what we were looking for," Riverin said, "I would be able to help better." "A weapon," Garen said. "You'll know it when you see it." He clenched his jaw, afraid the full answer might come tumbling out otherwise. Garen wasn't sure how long they searched, but they left nothing unturned. He even pulled up the roots of the strange flowers, pawing at the soil in case the sword had been buried. "It should be here!" He pounded a fist on the wall. Maybe there was a hidden room, a hollow space behind all the rock. He hit the solid surface until the sides of his hand were scratched and raw. Finally, Riverin pulled him to the center of the room, wrapping Garen in a bear hug from behind to protect them both from Garen's flailing limbs. "Why did you come here? What are you looking for?" Riveren's words felt loud in Garen's ear as the other man pinned his arms at his sides. Garen went limp, and his Starlock's light snuffed out. But still Riveren stayed at his back, clearly anticipating that Garen would get a second wind. Trust Riveren to have your back. A cutlass. It was almost painful to admit the words out loud. A starbridge. Riveren dropped Garen's arms, coming around as if assessing his face for truth. So you did learn something from the book. Garen shrugged. More like Aura. So she's leading you to the starbridges? I thought maybe it was the girl. Garen sighed. Might as well come clean about everything. She's leading me to both. Riveren went still. She found Daisy? The light we saw last moon. It was a starbridge, same as the light I saw when I was a boy. Riveren's eyes flashed with understanding. You think she came back? I know she did, or Aura knows she did. He hated revealing these things to Riveren, of all people, but it was also a weight off his chest. A sense of freedom came with sharing the burden, especially with someone who already knew the history of his obsession. You finally figured it out. Riveren grinned, shoving Garen's shoulder like he had when they were friends. Wait, then why are you still looking for a starbridge? I'm being extra thorough? Garen gave Riveren a weak smile, not really sure why he'd gotten so angry over the missing cutlass. It was like his inability to find the thing represented how much his hands had been tied in this whole hunt for Daisy. Just one more thing he couldn't reach. Aura made it sound like the starbridges are important. Even if I can't figure out why Aura wants them, if I can get across the barriers, maybe Enla would see my itch to travel as an asset. I could form alliances with other nations on her behalf, instead of being stuck back at the palace. Ah, such a noble excuse to keep adventuring. Riveren's dry tone earned him a punch to his shoulder. Then, trusting Enla's instincts instead of his own, Garen told Riveren everything, from the handwritten notes in his copy of The Sins of the Stars to Aura's suggestion that Enla was keeping Garen from Daisy. By this time, they'd settled comfortably in the cave, the glowing algae and the things it lit up or left dark no longer threatening. Riveren traced his finger in the dirt, taking everything in with a frown. Can Aura be trusted? It seems like you should trust your sister over a stranger. Aura has her own agenda, and like you said, she knows too much. She could be twisting everything to fit her plans. It's something I've considered, Garen shook his head. I don't know. I'm just not sure how dividing Enla and me would fit into any of her plans. She's not exactly forthcoming with her plans, Riveren pointed out. She just keeps guessing yours. She wanted me to come here, or at least she didn't stop me, even though she knew Enla didn't want me coming here. Does Enla know why you wanted to explore Lover's Falls? Garen flinched, both at his sister's name back on Riveren's tongue and the half-truth he'd had to tell Enla. Initially, I told her I wanted to ask the sprites for support, even though I meant to ask them to find Daisy. Once I had Aura to track Daisy, I didn't need their help. But then Aura told me about the cutlass, and it seemed like an opportunity I shouldn't pass up. Not when we were so close to it. But Enla didn't mention anything about a sword, Riveren said slowly. She would have seen and known, which means you probably don't find it. Or that she doesn't want me finding it. Garen groaned and rubbed his hands over his face. Why can't her visions be more absolute? But Aura told you the sword was here? She wrote it in that book you gave me, and hinted at it in her story about Lady Redwood and Captain Moss. Riveren shook his head slowly. That peddler must have lied. He said the book had been in his possession since he was a boy. Close to 50 years, unless... Is it possible Aura's been setting you up? Garen frowned. Setting me up for what? Well, your sister didn't want you coming to Lover's Falls, which means there's nothing good in her visions here. What if Aura knows what the sprites will do,
and she wants you, her competition for the Starbridge, out of the way.
Riveron's words left Garen tense, itching to tune in to his surroundings, which suddenly seemed sinister once more.
I mean, it's not like the sprites are known for their hospitality,
Riveron added with a laugh. Just as Garen sensed their heat, the weight of them in the room, one spoke, the words echoing through Garen's mind more than the cavern.
Such harsh words. We can be quite hospitable to guests.
Riveron and Garen jumped to their feet, hands on hilts. A creature moved from the shadows, its fluttering wings glowing green in the light of the algae, but Garen suspected they might be a golden yellow in different light. No mouth moved, but the room reverberated with the creature's words.
You, however, have come uninvited.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this first installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. To get reminders for new episodes and to stay up to date with my books, be sure to sign up for my newsletter at KarynNorton.com. You'll also get the prequel short story to Blood of the Stars in ebook and audio for free. Thanks so much for listening.